Dropping the Corn Laws in the mid-19th century was how Britain broke away from its long history of protectionism, allowing cheaper grain from around the world to flood the British market. But ending the Corn Laws wasn't only about making food more affordable.
When they're overturned, they usher in the beginnings of this experiment in free trade by the British, who were going to stick to free trade until the early 1930s in very remarkable ways. It's the closest thing to a national ideology that modern Britain will have, is the subscription to free trade as a result of this remarkable revolution and this unilateral embrace of free trade in 1846. I'm Marc Palen. I'm an associate professor in the Archaeology and History Department at the University of Exeter.
Palen is also the author of several books on trade, the latest one being Pax Economica, Left-Wing Visions of a Free World. Journalist Rhoda Metcalfe caught up with Marc Palen to delve into the very early days of globalization.
Why was Britain drawn into this first experiment into free trade in the first place? I mean, what led up to it?
Yeah, this would have been the mid-19th century.
Right.
The British up until this point were, much like the other rival empires, what we call mercantilist empires. They were protectionist empires, carving out their colonies that they would exploit for their own personal gain, to exploit raw materials to bring back to the metropoles. And so the Corn Laws were these protective tariffs on foreign grain that Britain had implemented, and it becomes sort of the iconic representation of the British mercantilist system.
At the same time, Britain is also in the throes of rapid industrialization, right?
That's right, yeah. So up until this point, these industrializing centers of Britain were being filled with very poor people who were struggling to put food on the table. And so one of the ways they were able to get the working classes on the side of this free trade movement was to offer the idea of cheap international food, wheat from, say, the United States or India that could flood in for much cheaper than you could get just by buying it from the wheat growers. And of course, so the ones who are gaining from this are these aristocratic landowners who monopolize most of the land in Britain and who have a lot of undue influence, shall we say, on British foreign policy making. So they're often the ones that are blamed for the militant foreign policy of the British Empire, and a similar story that could be told in other protectionist empires. And so for the free traders in Britain who succeed, it's partly this promise of food security for the British Isles. It's also this promise of undermining this militant aristocratic influence on foreign policies.
But something I find interesting about these early advocates of free trade is that they also had a wider vision of the impact free trade could have on the world, right? I mean, it wasn't just about bringing down the cost of food.
So it's not just about cheap food for consumers. No, it's also connected to this peace activism.
Right.
So this is the origins in many ways of what in international relations scholarship we call capitalist peace theory or interdependence theory, the idea that the closer you become as trading partners through trade liberalization, the less likely you are to go to war with one another as you become more dependent on one another.
Right.
And this is precisely what happens, at least within the European context across the mid-19th century. It's a time of relative peace. It's a time of relative freer trade as France and Britain sort of lead the way in normalizing trade relations across Western Europe.
And this was an idea, if I'm not mistaken, that Adam Smith first set out, right, in the 1700s, the idea that trade instead of colonization, trade instead of war.
Yeah, I mean, Adam Smith, when he publishes The Wealth of Nations in 1776, he is one of the early enunciators of this idea. And he is very clear, too, about connecting a free trade policy with not just peaceful relations, but also a way to mollify the demands of the colonies, right? So this was a way to decolonize the British Empire, in his view, because if we just let the 13 colonies in North America go peacefully, that they would probably remain friends and trading partners down the long road. And so for Adam Smith and his mid-19th century disciples like Richard Cobden and a variety of others, it's this close connection between free trade, food security, cheap goods, but also a more peaceful and anti-imperial world order that they envisioned.
And it's interesting that Richard Cobden, who's sort of the leader of this trade liberalization movement, he and a lot of the movement are based in Manchester, right? In Manchester, England?
That's right. Yeah. So this is Manchester, England is the hotbed of a lot of this free trade activism at this time.
And not surprising because this is also a hotbed of industrialization, right?
Absolutely, and very much keen to thinking about where you're going to get those inputs for manufacturers. Of course, infamously, cotton from the U.S. South at this time, but also, say, wheat from the American West and so forth. So Manchester makes sense from kind of industrial perspective, but it is also just where this ideological hotbed is, and this is why Richard Cobden, as a leader of the Anti-Corn Law League, this free trade movement, this term Cobdenism that is associated with this idea of free trade, foreign policy, non-interventionism, and peace, also becomes known as the Manchester School or Manchester liberalism, as it's still known in some circles, right? So, this is where it all begins. And of course, you even have some radicals from even farther on the left of the political spectrum who are in Manchester at this time too. A guy named Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, who this is also going to be an important moment for them to be witnessing Britain's turn to free trade, although perhaps with different end goals in mind.
Interesting. And free trade, it became more feasible because of the advances in technology, right? What was happening in the world to make it so much more globalized?
It really taps into this millenarian spirit in many ways of the mid-19th century. And as you just pointed out, these new technological marvels of globalization, steamship lines, the successful laying of the transatlantic telegraph in the mid-1860s, the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, the completion of the Transcontinental Railway in the United States in the same year, 1869. This is shrinking the world in ways that people could have only imagined or hadn't even imagined. And so it's sparking the imagination. This is why Jules Verne writes Around the World in 80 Days. He's in fact picking up on this very sort of globalist spirit that's taking a charge. And if you connect this, as they did, with this turn to free trade by Britain and then subsequently by the United States for a time in Western Europe, sometimes the coercive enforcement of free trade elsewhere, but it was this remarkable moment that sparked the imagination that we could live in a globalized world that was more peaceful and prosperous rather than a dog-eat-dog, war-torn world of empires constantly battling it out for resources around the world.
So, how many nations were drawn into this first wave of free trade? England, France, what other countries were drawn into it?
Approximately 40 or 50 nations in Western Europe that get on board. The United States also gets on board much earlier, actually. So the United States kind of gets things started in 1846 as well, when it also starts drastically lowering its tariffs. And this, again, sparks the imagination that Anglo-American relations might actually become more friendly as a result of this kind of joint free trade experiment that's happening. And this is, of course, going to help spark the transatlantic peace movement in many ways. And they think it's going to help stop this, what is otherwise a very contentious period of Anglo-American relations up until this point.
So the free traders were right insofar as there was a peace dividend for a period of time.
Yeah, and that is certainly what they point to, and that is what capitalist peace theorists point to as one of the kind of key historical precedents that, beginning with the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty of 1860, you actually do see a normalization of relations with France and Britain, the two great rivals, and so they start trading with one another instead of fighting with one another for a while, and a variety of other nations in Europe start getting on board this trade liberalization gravy train.
But over time, certain players in this new trading relationship started to lose out, right? And there's a point at which sort of the competitive nature of free trade begins to bring prices and profits down.
As do new tools of globalization, as do the new tools of the industrial age. So on top of the fact that steamship lines and so forth are drastically lowering transportation costs, you also have these new kind of agricultural tools that are being embraced and implemented by farmers. And of course, this allows them to produce a lot more, which is going to further bring down prices through this increased production, as well as the increased trade flows and the speed of it. And so this is great for the consumers of the period.
Right.
It's great for the banks who are giving out loans to these farmers who are, who need to take these loans out to buy this new equipment so they can keep up with the Joneses, as we say. So it's great for everybody except for the debt-ridden farmers who are finding it very difficult to pay back those loans because, one, there's very little profit to be made at this point because of the drastic drop in prices, as well as the deflationary effects of the international gold standard at the time. So for the debt-ridden farmers of this period in particular, this is going to backfire on them at least, and this is going to lay the groundwork for what becomes known as the Long Depression from 1873 to 1896. Certain sectors at least get hit by this deflationary effect and the lower cost of goods.
Is there any evidence that the free trade advocates of the time anticipated that this would happen?
Not really. They did have a very kind of rose-tinted view about how this would all play out, and I don't know if they could have predicted at the time the medium and longer-term effects of this kind of race to get these new tools of globalization and industrialization and agricultural production that were going to play into this. And they also tended to be staunch defenders, by and large, of the international gold standard system.
Why did that occur? Why was there a return to the gold standard?
Well, there was, I think it partly was the need for certainty. They were moving into new terrain, and so having one of the key basic principles of international exchange, which was, people using different currencies, but if they all tagged their currencies to the same metal, gold, and we all could agree on the price of gold at a particular moment, this would mean that you could have a very easy exchange rate and ease the functions of trading at this time. So this made sense to traders, this made sense to bankers, it made sense to just about everybody except those who were taking out massive loans.
So you've sort of touched on this already, but what really brought this first chapter of free trade to an end?
Essentially, what happens is the Long Depression is going to lead to, as we've seen most recently too, this tendency during times of economic crisis for nations to look out for themselves.
Right.
The turn towards the search for self-sufficiency again. So this is where this brief experiment, this 25-ish year experiment from 1846 to around 1870 starts coming to a very quick end as one rival empire of the British after another turns to infant industrial protectionism and colonial expansion to find new markets for exporting surplus capital.
And by this point, I mean, as I understand it, younger economies like the U.S. had started to argue that Britain's push for free trade was really just a ploy, that they were trying to take advantage of younger economies like the American economy before it really had grown enough to be able to compete. Right?
Yeah. This critique is put forward right around the same time that Britain is overturning the Corn Laws by a very, very famous and influential German-American economist named Frederick List in a book called The National System of Political Economy, which comes out in the early 1840s. And it doesn't pick up a whole lot of subscribers at the time, but from around 1870 onwards, it's going to have a lot of subscribers amongst these rivals of the British who are making this very point that maybe the British free traders had been a bit duplicitous in their promises that this is going to be good for everybody. Maybe in reality, this is just good for the British. Our industries are quite a bit behind the British, and so maybe we need to give us sort of some temporary protections from the full force of global market competition, and hence part of the justification for these high tariff laws is to allow these industries to foster in newer industrial states like the United States, like Germany, like France.
Right.
We can say it's cynical, but for them at least, people looking back in the 1870s and 1880s in the midst of an economic crisis, they were wondering if they'd been led astray by the idea that free trade was going to be this panacea, when in fact there were going to definitely be some losers as well as winners.
And it was also kind of interesting to see what happened with some of Britain's former colonies, like Canada and Australia. They started to put up their own tariff walls as well once this sort of return to tariffs began.
So there are interesting exceptions to that for Britain's colonies that it deemed to be less civilized, that couldn't be entrusted with their own fiscal policies, like Ireland or India. They had free trade forced upon them and had to resort to grassroots methods to try to develop their own industries. What
do you mean by that? What do you mean by it was forced on them?
being forced to raw material production in India rather than industrial production, these kinds of things that were happening as a result of this coercive power dynamic is an important part here. But I think to your point, what is also fascinating about the same time frame is that those areas of the British Empire that were deemed to be civilized and the so-called white settler colonies of Canada and Australia, they are given their own control over fiscal policy across the late 19th century. They, of course, assumed that their own colonies would choose the free trade path as laid out by the British. One of the fascinating things that I've dug into more in my own work and in the article is that rather than turn to British-style free trade, they turn to this economic nationalism of Frederick List, of the American protectionists, the Republican Party.
Why didn't they follow the British model?
I think part of it was that the United States does start rapidly industrializing during this protectionist period, and to a certain extent Germany, and they do start catching up to the British. And so I think if you were in some of these colonies that also wanted to develop your industries, you're looking at this and saying, we should be doing what the United States is doing, not what the British are doing. That may be good for Britain, but it's not where we are yet. And so maybe we need to follow this infant industrial model that the United States and Germany have laid out, and apparently quite successfully.
So this return to sort of a more widespread trade liberalization only begins to rise again after World War II, right?
Yeah. So the United States is going to find itself in very similar kind of hegemonic shoes in the 1940s when it's the most powerful manufacturer in the world.
Right.
And it starts encouraging the rest of the world to open up its markets, as the United States is also doing. And there's a similar altruism that's motivating it, as there was amongst the free traders in the 1840s. The Secretary of State under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Cordell Hull, who was one of his nicknames was the Tennessee Cobden.
Okay. Right.
And as well as the father of the United Nations, because he's also a big proponent that supranational regulation of the world trade system is necessary, because nations, historically, if left to their own devices, will inevitably at some point turn back inwards and turn towards this economic nationalist approach that he and others blame for laying the economic groundwork for 2 world wars.
So what can we take away from this early experience of free trade? I mean, what kind of lessons do we see? What kind of echoes in the push and pull we're seeing now around tariffs and free trade?
I would say one of those lessons that I think the free traders of the mid-19th century, or all the way through this kind of imperial and protectionist era, is that they underappreciated the power of nationalism. And I think that we can point to a similar underappreciation of the power of nationalism in the globalist soothsayers of the 1990s, early 2000s, understandably kind of like in the 1840s and then this kind of trade liberalization with North American Free Trade Agreement, the EU, the creation of the World Trade Organization. You can understand that there are all these books about the rise of global citizenship that were coming out. But if they could jump forward to what's happened since the almost decade since 2016, I think they maybe take some lessons that once again nationalism was underappreciated in its political power. But I guess there is something very different though to what existed or didn't exist in the 1870s, and that is you still do have these supranational regulatory organizations that exist as assuming that the big powers that be still put trust into them and still put trust into international norms and trade rules. This might just be another nationalistic blip. So there maybe is like a silver lining here, that there's a much wider tool set available for keeping trade internationalism afloat, even despite this nationalist uptick we're currently living through.
But also the internet and the technology of today. I mean, it's created such a globalized community and a globalized market. I mean, you can't underestimate the impact of that either, right?
And of course, I mean, the flows and interconnectivity is so much greater now than it was, of course, even back in this kind of millenarian moment of the mid to late 19th century. I think that also is why this current kind of nationalist and protectionist moment that we find ourselves in, again, maybe there's another reason why it might be short-lived, because the global system that we find ourselves in really just isn't made for trade wars. It really isn't, right? Even more than it was 100 years ago. And so perhaps there's a bit of self-correcting that could happen as a result of that too.
Wow. Well, it's certainly fascinating to see the way ideas around trade liberalization and protection keep circling back. Marc Palen, thank you so much for being on the podcast today to tell us about this incredible chapter in our economic history.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
That was Marc Palen, Associate Professor in the Archaeology and History Department at the University of Exeter. He was speaking with Rhoda Metcalfe. Marc Palen's latest book, Pax Economica, is published by Princeton University Press. He also has an article on the history of free trade in the September edition of Finance and Development magazine. Go to imf.org/F&D. And look for other IMF podcasts on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. You can also follow us on X. Our handle is @IMF_podcast. I'm Bruce Edwards.
And I'm Rhoda Metcalfe. Thanks for listening.